All right. Is this recording? I think it is. Lindsay, hi. How you going?
Pretty good so far.
So, just here with Lindsay Gaze, the father of, or one of the fathers of basketball here in Australia, and we're here to talk a little bit about your recollection of Melbourne University and our involvement with basketball. And maybe to kick things off, what are your first memories of Melbourne University as a basketball club?
Well, the memories are blurred around that time in regard to the progression of the sport was through the very young junior levels, under 12s, 14, 16, 18, 20 and so forth. But the Melbourne University club were already seniors, so they weren't progressing through the ranks and being identified as being elite basketball teams. And my first memory is basically that they were playing in the second division of the Victorian Championships, which included clubs rather than association representative teams. So Melbourne University qualified as a club, and others began or were competing as clubs, although representing associations. And it came about that the Victorian Basketball Association changed their rules to say that you must be represented by an association or nominated by an association. And our Melbourne team, or Melbourne Association, had two teams that competed at the first division level, and one of them, our second team, was then adopted by the Knox Association, because we couldn't nominate two.
Was that the Melbourne Basketball Association, and now you're
The Melbourne Basketball Association had, I suppose, almost coincidentally, teams that were playing in the Victorian Championships.
What year was this?
Well, if you go back to the early 50s, there weren't too many associations, and the Victorian Championships included sometimes with more than one team. The YMCA had two or three teams that were playing at the first division level, and other teams were more likely to be ethnic groups. So could be the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Estonians weren't so regular, but the Greeks and the Italians were there. And I can remember having a discussion with the media, the newspapers. I was trying to get coverage in the press, and they told me it's too hard, because when you look at the basketball at that time, it's either an ethnic ball or a church parade. So you had church, Presbyterians, CYMS, YMCA, or the Latvians, the Greeks, the Lithuanians, and so on. And somewhere below that, like with the second division level, there was the Melbourne University. And,
in the 50s? In the 50s?
Would have been very late 50s, early 60s. I can't remember them being in the competitions when we were playing out at the showgrounds or the exhibition buildings. They were two locations where the top divisions were played before we moved into Albert Park. But it wasn't until we moved into Albert Park that I recall the university playing at a higher level than just the local domestic competition basketball.
When did those higher levels begin?
Oh, as soon as we opened at Albert Park. They were there before then, because our Victorian Championships, I recall, were played at the exhibition buildings, or they went from, because we're getting tossed out of the exhibition buildings on a regular basis, because an exhibition would come in, that cancelled the basketball, so there were too many interruptions.
This is at Carlton Gardens?
The exhibition buildings, yeah.
Yep.
And so then they moved out, and it was very regular at the showgrounds.
When would it have begun at the exhibition buildings?
Oh, it would have been in the late 40s, early 50s.
Would that
I mean, there was an Australian Championship played at the exhibition buildings. I think, I could be proven wrong, I think it was 1951.
And prior to those late 40s, early 50s, was there like high level, was that the beginning of like championship basketball in Victoria?
Not quite. The Basketball Victoria was formed in 1931, and there was competition played in church halls or army drill halls and so forth at that time. And then the war interrupted it. So in 1946, they had the first Australian Championships, and that was before my time. I have no idea how they picked a team, and the rules were different at that time. They used to have a jump ball after every score. So if you had a good centre, you had a good chance of winning. And so in those days that they were played, you know, in halls or army drill halls or whatever. But in the early 50s, the Showgrounds Hall was the destination for our Victorian Championships.
And then I think you mentioned in the late 50s or early 60s, Albert Park came about.
Albert Park came about in late 1958, which was when I was appointed to be, earlier in 1958, I was appointed to be effectively a project supervisor of the conversion of the shed that became a 6-court basketball stadium. And so I was giving directions to the builders about some of the elements that were required for basketball. And then we had our first competition games in 1950, I think it was either late October or November 1958.
What were those sheds doing before you got hold of them?
Well, they were storage sheds for Commonwealth vehicles, or something to do with the Commonwealth. And because they were basically relics of the war period, the chairman of the Albert Park Trust wanted to make some use of them, and approached the various sports about creating venues for them.
Which is how
So basketball was the first, and badminton and table tennis came shortly after that.
Right.
And then much later than that, the squash courts were built just from scratch. So they weren't conversions of anything, just new squash courts that were there. And contrary to what some people might think, those sports got on really well together. There was no sort of rivalry elements or disputes or anything like that. And they were all operating successfully. And of course, basketball was progressing at a lot faster rate, because it went from 6 courts to 8 courts. And then we were able to get a 9th court there when the government said, that's it, no more, alienation of parklands, blah, blah, blah. So that finished it. But it wasn't really until we played it at the Albert Park Stadium that the Victorian Championships became something to take notice of.
And was Melbourne Uni involved?
Melbourne, there were two divisions to start with, first division, second division, and later on we had a third division, and the rules of eligibility and qualification changed gradually over the years, in those early days particularly, and they converted from clubs to association representative teams. So an association may have a team in first, second and third division.
What would be some examples of some associations at that time?
Well, they were associations that had been developed through the development of facilities.
Like CYMS and NCBA?
CYMS was always at Albert Park. I can't remember them having a facility anywhere else.
Sorry, what about VBHBA?
Victorian business houses were like other relatively new associations playing in suburban venues. Church halls, army drill halls, youth clubs, that sort of stuff. The metro and southern districts, when I say metro and southern districts, metro started and at Albert Park, and the co-tenant on Tuesday nights at Albert Park was originally the Olympic Association. The Olympic Association became more interested in the Dandenong facility, where Dandenong had started off playing in the market hall. The market was conducted X days of the week, and then other days in the week is for basketball.
Did you mean at Victoria Market?
No, the Dandenong.
Oh, right.
Dandenong Market.
The Dandenong Market.
Yeah,
really?
the Dandenong Market.
The Dandenong Market used to host basketball.
Yes, yeah, until they, we got organised and built a legitimate basketball stadium.
Yep.
So, that sort of evolution took place from playing in the youth club halls or YMCAs and church halls, and to getting into legitimate basketball venues. And so when you got into those venues, they would be producing and developing teams that were qualifying for high-level competition, high level at that time, and so the Victorian Championships evolved that way.
And you mentioned that Melbourne Uni didn't have an association that it was part of, it was a club.
No, it's a university club, but their sole entry to the Victorian Championship First Division was before there was legislation in regard to qualifying to play in the Victorian Championships. So those that were clubs became identified with associations, and then reversed the associations, nominated back. Perhaps a good example would be the team that Barry Barnes played for. Barry,
the Olympic coach, yeah.
Yeah, and Owen Hughan, who was
the Horsham guy.
That group was originally playing with the Church Association, which was the forerunner to the Melbourne Basketball Association, and they were playing as Saint Mathias and the Saints. But then when they had the change to being required to be nominated by an association, they were adopted by the Presbyterian Association. And so the Prezies, and they became, they had a number of different iterations, but the transfer because the Presbyterian Association folded, and then they sort of gravitated towards the Melbourne East Basketball Association, Nunawading, and And so the evolution
became the
continued.
Spectres, I guess. They became the Spectres, I guess.
Became what?
The Spectres, the Nunawading Spectres, or?
Yes, yeah, ultimately, and then Melbourne East, and then Nunawading Spectres, nominated by, but then the Nunawading Spectres became basically independent as they went into the NBL.
So back to Melbourne Uni a little bit. You recall teams from that period, like playing in the decent divisions, and do you have recollection of any of the people involved at that time?
Well, I sort of became aware of some of the players from their different connections with the hierarchy of Basketball Victoria. Henry Cooper was one who became a very important, influential administrator of the Co-operative Society, which was the body that basically built the Albert Park Stadium. So it wasn't Basketball Victoria that built that, it was the Co-operative Community Advancement Society Limited that built it. And Henry became the chairman of that. This was after Jack Carter and others that were part of the administration at that time.
When was this?
Well, the co-op, when they built it, was 1958, 59.
Mm-hmm. So Henry was involved in that building of the stadium back then?
He wasn't there originally, but he became involved after Jack Carter retired and died.
So after that stadium was built and other stadiums were being built?
Yeah. Well then, so Henry became very interested and very much involved in the Altona development, and his expertise and his smarts guided them to become a very effective association. But unlike others, that particular association wasn't totally dedicated towards the glamour of playing at the highest level, because many associations around the traps were spending more than they should on trying to compete high at that highest level. But Henry, in his wisdom, didn't allocate a budget beyond their abilities to do it effectively. And so that led to, or has led to, further expansion of the facilities there. And, he continues to do very well in his administrative abilities. And then there were others, Gerry Tickell, who, I'm stretching my memory, but I think he was involved with the Essendon Technical College, teaching there, and
former Melbourne Uni player and
Melbourne Uni
administrator.
Yeah, and Norm Longmuir, I think I remember he was a little bit more bulky, when he was playing, and I can't remember any of the other players. If someone prompted me, I probably would. I think there might have been a Campbell, but anyway, that was part of those pioneering days in regard to the evolution of higher levels of basketball competition.
And those players that you recall, like Gerry Tickell and Norm Longmuir, what memories do you have of their contribution to basketball?
Okay. Well, in retrospect, they weren't what you might call star players. They were good players at that level, but not like the fanatical, dedicated, committed players who had aspirations for being on the Olympic team. You know, they were playing good competitive basketball, but probably more likely described at the social level. I never heard of them training vigorously, and I've got to say that my experiences with the annual university games led me to disappointment, because over my lifetime I've tried to convince the universities to develop university sport. Now, they have sport in the universities, but it's not what I would describe as university sport, a la like in the United States. And so what disappointed me was when they had their annual university games and the basketball was part of the schedule there. I can remember, I think it might have been even Henry that showed me a program for the basketball. And it started off like describing introduction, welcomes, formalities and so forth. And there might have been a reception for the start of the competition, which I think included an 18-gallon keg or something, you see. And I was always critical of the university games, although it was tremendously exciting for the participants and they were very serious about their competition, but there's never any genuine training and preparation as if it was a significant national competition or highest level. It was, how would I describe it? A festival, you know.
Pretty social. Pretty social.
Very social. And, you know, so, which is, it's okay in itself, but for me, one, being a non-drinker, being concerned about trying to elevate standards all the time, it just seemed to be a lost opportunity, and still is, I think, with university sport. Because so much more could be done for the sport and sports in general, other sports, because the comment that I make is that if I'm an NBL coach and what becomes apparent more frequently these days, I get fired. What's the next step? Where does he have a job anymore? And I believe that university sport could be pathways both upwards and I'm not going to say downwards, but
sideways.
But, you know, for aspiring phys ed teachers to become athletes or athletes going to university, but basically emulated the United States college system. And I remember speaking to one of the professors at Deakin University. He buried me on that. You know, Basketball Victoria is doing a review, had commissioned professor whatever, a couple of people there to interview people in the sport, inviting them to comment about what might happen in the future. And I was invited and thought, oh, you know, I thought I was redundant by then, but nevertheless, I did mention that as one of the things that I thought would be desirable. I got buried. No chat. We're not going to do stuff like the United States. No.
On that topic, Lindsay, there has been a recent initiative, which is the UBL. There is now a university basketball league, and there are teams travelling interstate to play each other, and it's a pretty well well-funded thing at the moment from the university.
It's very, very encouraging, and I thought, because it was before I had that meeting with the Deakin University professor, we had a university games in Melbourne, and the basketball was played at MSAC, and representatives of various universities had a meeting. I attended a meeting and I raised the subject of university basketball, or University Basketball League if you like, and there was fairly good interest. You know, I'd have thought there was I'd give it about a 60% majority of those that were there were receptive. And it was after that, in fact, well after it, that I had this discussion with the Deakin people, just got buried.
Yeah, I think.
So I thought, oh well, bad luck. You know, it's a pity. So if that started now, well, that I think is a great step forward.
I find it a little bit complicated because of the expense involved. It's an expensive thing to ship players interstate, and
yeah.
Anyway, it's been initiated. Lindsay, I'm really curious on the topic of phys ed. My understanding is that you actually had a role at Melbourne University.
I did.
A teaching role, perhaps.
I did indeed. I was asked if I would conduct classes for the first year phys ed students.
When was that?
I'm thinking somewhere about the 70s, late 70s, somewhere about that. You could measure it by checking on the ages of some of the students there at the time. And by that I mean there were several league footballers that were in the class. Peter Crimmins was one. I don't know if you remember him. He died of testicular cancer, very young age. The Carlton guru was
Ron Barassi?
No, Ron wasn't there, but geez, why did I forget? Anyway, he's been a commentator on the TV with football. I think he's recently retired. But when I say he was one of my students, so what? Neil Roberts was another one, you know, great champion from St Kilda and Brownlow and I told, you mean as a student? I said, yeah, but they were senior students. So sort of well beyond graduating from their education, you know, late comers to teaching and phys ed, but I think...
And you were teaching phys ed at
phys
the
ed, yeah. I was teaching basketball to the phys ed students, the first year phys ed students.
So that they could go on and teach it in schools, I guess.
And the theory for me was that if we're going to propagate the sport and get sport into the schools, then it would help to educate the teachers so then they can pass that on. So what happened was that many of the graduates of that phys ed class became good basketball teachers. And, you know, one of them was more enthusiastic than all of the rest, and he went on to teach at Caulfield Grammar, and he was so enthusiastic he became the first, or the Caulfield Grammar became the first school to take a bunch of their students to the States and play against high schools over there. And
what was his name?
and he had never played basketball ever before that phys ed class.
What was his name?
I'm trying to remember.
That's okay.
Can't remember, but you know, he was not an athlete himself, you know, as per se.
Was there a long period of time that you were teaching that class? How long did you do it?
10 years.
10 years.
10 years, and what caused the finish of that was that the Melbourne University decided to end the phys ed course because it wasn't a degree course. It was only a 2-year course. And I suspect that they were later, much later, second-guessing that decision, because Deakin became the leading light in regard to phys ed, research and development, and, you know that sort of thing, and the status of physical education, human movement or whatever you like to call it, has been elevated in the, I think, the hierarchy of
Secondary
the
school.
education field.
Yeah.
And but anyway, I think the situation is that the Melbourne University no longer has that phys ed course.
And over the period that you were there, was it predominantly male students?
Yes.
Were there women students?
I can't remember female students.
Not one.
Can't remember. I don't think so.
Over the course of 10 years.
Yeah.
And so I guess most of the physical education teachers in schools were mostly men.
Well, at that time they were. I'm sure it's changed now.
Yes.
But at that time,
and
they were the sort of the pioneers in regard to basketball teaching in the schools.
And those students that you taught, were you teaching them things other than basketball, or were other people
just
teaching
basketball?
Them? So other people were teaching them other things.
Yeah, whether it be aerobics or the thing that just sort of interested me at the time. We'd start the course. Like many students, a little bit reserved and feeling their way about what they could do or how they could improve their play and so on. But Bert Willey was the head of the phys ed department at that time of British extract. Typically, I would identify him like British Sergeant Major, very much of the discipline type, and he was very fit as well in my time there. He might have faded away later on, and you'd note from those phys ed students from the start of the year to the end of the year how fit they got. You know, they're doing bloody handstands and when they're warming up and doing things that were typical of physical development. Being sharp, well, and you could see the muscle start to, and their quickness and their skills and all that. The second year, whoop, down they went, because the course changed to be more academic rather than physical. And, some of them at the end of their second year, I should remember, in all of my time, I had only one player who didn't pass the course, because we had a little bit of theory with the practical part of the course, and so at the end of the year, passes were made, and it was like the deputy leader of the phys ed course, the woman, I'm trying to remember her name now too, but anyway, she came to me and said, "Mr. Gaze, what are we going to do about Mr. Rigos?" It was the student. I said, well, you know, he really showed that he hadn't really studied or applied himself to the point where you say he would earn A+. But what are we going to do? Because they didn't want anyone failing the course, like the Phys Ed course. And I said, well, what I think we can do is we can require him to attend our Victorian Championship games, played weekly, for a month, and then I'll give him another test. So after each game, he should provide an analysis of the game, I'd say at the layman's level, anyway, and after the 4 weeks, we'll give him another test. He passed. And so everyone was happy.
was that course conducted in the old bow repair centre?
Yes, yeah.
It was a pretty tight facility with rings stuck against the wall. Not exactly the ideal basketball.
Not at all. But it was quite good in those days, you know, compared to other places. I mean, I played in a hall that was halfway up the wall was out. You know, you had to put your foot against the wall to indicate you're out of bounds when you put the ball in play. So, you know, compared to the Barber, compared to that was quite good.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any recollection? Did you have any involvement with the basketball club at Melbourne Uni at that time?
No.
So just
only via the players to the university. No, I wasn't involved in that. It was just strictly, for me, it was just strictly with the Phys Ed course. And I don't think, from memory, I don't think too many of those that were in that course were playing with the university representative team. I mean, they were just starting to learn the game. So it was something very new to them, so we were teaching them. And what I said right at the start of the course, I said, I'm not here to teach you how to play the game. I'm here to teach you how to teach the game. So I don't expect you to be able to be playing at a high level through the course of our subject, but what we want you to do is to be able to teach others how to play the game.
That's awesome. Thank you, Lindsay. I'm just going through some notes here. We have some players who have been through our university club who you may be familiar with, such as, well, I'm not quite sure, but like certainly Mel Speed and Ian Speed and Ray Watson perhaps, and Peter Byrne. And maybe some others. I mean, that's just some names that I can see off the top of an interview with Peter Byrne recently.
Yeah, well, Peter's still pretty enthusiastic, and he's doing his own biography, I think. He's writing something, but I spoke with him just a few weeks ago, and he's pretty keen. Mel Speed, of course, I would identify him as being the most ambitious member of our club.
When you say
and
club,
our association, we play with the Melbourne Tigers,
right?
And as history has shown, President of Basketball Victoria, President of Basketball Australia, Chairman of the National Basketball League, President, I think, of the Australian Cricket Association, President of the ICC. So, he's had an incredible career, and I think he would probably still tell some interesting stories about his early days as a solicitor and barrister, and Ian Speed, he asked me, this is going back a few years now, not that long ago, but he asked me to speak at his bowls club, and which I did, and I knew absolutely zero about bowls. But there are principles when you think about coaches and athletes and preparation for whatever the contest might be. And, I did that and just forgot about it and went on about my normal processes. Ian called me at the end of their season and said they won it.
Lovely.
I said, well, give me credit. But Ian's a really classy guy.
So those blokes there, I imagine some of them would have put on a Melbourne Uni singlet at the Albert Park Stadium that you were probably administering at some point.
I can't remember them playing with Melbourne University. That they might have, but I doubt it, because they were pretty heavily committed to the Melbourne Tigers and wouldn't have had too much time to be involved with other programs, the basketball programs, because I think we had an advantage through those years of having, I would say, without fear of being criticised, privileged access to training opportunities. So what we would do is that we'd train after work from 5:30 till 6:30, and then play the first game of our association competition, in our A-grade competition, which we were clearly far too much ahead of the rest to say that it was fair competition. But the other teams didn't mind it, because we wouldn't play in the finals. We just played, and those games were used as an extension of our practice.
With the Melbourne Tigers.
Yeah, and so, but the likes of Mel Speed, Ian Speed, John Maddock, who became president of Basketball Victoria and Australia, grew up through the junior program. Now this I don't know if now or later or whatever you want to do about the Melbourne Tigers, but the origins of the Melbourne Tigers is through the Church of England.
I think we should come back to that one with a Tigers interview.
Yeah, because the way that has evolved is, I think, somewhat interesting for to clarify the history of that, the evolution of the Melbourne Tigers from, like everyone else, like every other association, from absolute grassroots, with not much knowledge about the sport, trying to garner knowledge from somewhere, somehow, from different people. And so people like the Mormons and American coaches that we brought out here and so on, they're all part of it.
The Mormons are interesting. I mean, Melbourne University had a Mormon coach, Elder Reed, I think, in the 50s.
Reed, he was a good one. He was a good player.
And so what's your recollection of the Mormons with regard to Melbourne University basketball?
Well, I got to admit, I don't remember Elder Reed coaching the university, but I do remember Mormons who came out here were interested in doing that, and they would, take on duties, I'd call it, about the way that they'd proselytise their faith and so forth, and they'd use those sorts of environments to spread the word for them. And but the Mormons started off individually playing with teams, coaching teams, sometimes putting on a clinic. But prior to the 1956 Olympics, instead of just having players join teams, they assembled their own team, and it was felt that they might stack it with very good players, which they did, and they played in our state championships. And so some of them still went out proselytising and coaching and doing things like that with other groups, but they made a terrific contribution to basketball in their time, at that time. But then, shortly after the Olympics, the word came down from the higher-ups,
Salt Lake City,
to stop teams entering competitions.
which I guess would have led them into coaching Melbourne Uni and things like that.
Yeah, they ended that, and I remember talking to the state leader here in Melbourne, trying to convince them that we should be an exception. He was very supportive of my efforts, but said it couldn't be done. And so, obviously I was trying to help boost the standard of our programs. They had such good people and very good players. I'll tell you one side story. The Mormons played an exhibition game against our state team when we were officially opening the Albert Park Stadium. There was a fellow, one of the best Mormons we had playing. His name was Bob Skousen. He was a great athlete and a really good player. And I can remember in that game, we had him tied up in the corner, deep corner, with his back to the basket and the clock ticking down. And he literally said, "I've never done this before," pivot in the air, whack it, down it went, and they finished up beating us. Fast forward a few years, and we were travelling the United States, playing college games over there, and we were playing a game against Brigham Young University, which was his alma mater. And he came to me reminiscing about our times in Melbourne and so on, and I said to him, "Would you like to join us on the rest of the tour?" Because, he was a great player. And he said, "Oh, yeah, that'll be all right," because he hadn't played for a while, but it was still good enough to help us. He said, "I'll chat with my wife." So then he introduced his wife to me, and when I saw her, I thought, why would anyone go anywhere without her? She was absolutely magnificent, and she wouldn't let him go. And I said, well, in reverse, I could understand why you would stay home while we're on tour. But he died just a few years ago, and I received a note from his son, who was advocating he should have been included in the Brigham Young Basketball Hall of Fame, which I obviously supported. but it didn't mean anything. You know, they never inducted him to their Hall of Fame, but I struggle to understand why, because he had a terrific record and he was really a great player.
Interesting. Lindsay, I think we've got a lot of it, but like just before we wrap up, you used to live at the old Albert Park Stadium. Was your place the Pete's Bar?
Well, it didn't start there. When I was supervising the construction of the building, there was a little shack in front of the sheds, you know, and in front of, slightly, not quite right in front of the basketball area, was somewhere like in front of what was the area separating the tables of the badminton and the basketball. And that shed, I call it, had two small rooms that would be, I think, smaller from here to the wall there. You know, very, very small rooms, plus a larger room where I lived. And what I did, I converted that hut into habitable, I'm not going to say home, it was a habitable quarters for living. And my mother and I lived there until we put the two court extensions, the 7 and 8, at the end of the stadium. And at that time, they took pity on me and said, we'll build a residence towards the back of the stadium, which was I think probably about 10 squares, which is not that big, with 3 bedrooms, a lounge room, kitchen, the bathroom. And so that's where we lived, and that's where I had on numerous occasions cause to have late nights checking the burglars. So there's some weird stories on that, but
I think it's in Andrew's book, isn't it?
What's that?
It's in Andrew's book, isn't it? The burglar stuff.
Was it? Yeah, could have been, yeah. So, there was some very interesting situations there.
Was that Pete's Bar though? Was that the...
That's what we converted it. So when the kids were growing up, and it was really too small for our kids and our family to stay in that, and so the first thing was, I thought that we were having so many teams visit that there might be some merit in turning it into a dormitory, which we did. A few of the teams stayed there. At an interstate tournament, someone stayed there. So we put double bunks in the 3 bedrooms, and there was enough there to accommodate a team, except for their officials. And but what it did, of course, it saved the visitors a lot of money, and in our case, it saved us money when we had like the college teams come and stay there. But that didn't last that long because it really wasn't quite large enough to be a genuine dormitory type accommodation. And then it got converted to Pete's Bar. There was a fellow, ex-Richmond footballer, who had the licence for a pub just over the road virtually from the stadium.
Which pub was that? Was it the Rising Sun?
Hmm?
Was it the Rising Sun?
Yeah. And so he asked if they could develop their licence at that venue, and became somewhat, I'm not saying notorious, but I think it was an asset because of the social interaction of the participants. It was the Wednesday night, of course, that was the most popular because of the Championship Division night. So they'd gather there and stay there pretty late. On other nights, it was okay, but not what you might call
raucous.
Chockers. They go there, but
what year roughly did you move out and it become a dormitory? And what year roughly did it go from a dormitory to become Pete's Bar?
it didn't stay a dormitory for very long. Probably only maybe 3 years or something like that that it was a dormitory. Trying to remember the era. So we can reverse this by checking how old Andrew is now, going back to when he was about 13 or 14.
Okay, so when Andrew was 13 or 14, it became a dormitory.
Yeah, maybe just before he turned 14.
Yep.
Because we moved to St Kilda. There was a place that was previously a boarding house. Had 6 bungalows in the backyard, and just I don't know how many. Not toilets, but it was sort of subdivided and a mess. When you consider the cost of properties today and for what we paid for it then, you say, wow. Because, let me put it this way. There were 2 properties in the street where we were. One was valued at about 50,000 and the other was valued at about 44,000. The one that was valued at 50,000 was much bigger and much better than the one we got. But the extra cost was too much for us.
Yeah, understood.
So anyway, a major job of renovation and things like that, which I did in what very little spare time I had.
Who was Pete? Who was Pete, Lindsay? With regard to Pete's Bar, why was it Pete's Bar?
Pete was, I don't know, someone that was, I think, connected with the St Kilda club.
Was Pete involved in operating the bar?
No. Oh, no.
Well, why was it called Pete's Bar?
Because of this guy who was, I think, the social connector. That he would be the sort of the catalyst to get people socialising. But you need, because being a non-drinker, I never inhabited Pete's Bar.
Really?
Never.
Really?
Never. And I did when it was closed, of course.
Sure.
I had to clean it up. But no, I was never involved in the post-game social activities. And so I don't know the absolute history of how it became Pete's Bar, but the name lives on with the annual...
Yes, the lunch.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great, Lindsay. Thanks. And lastly, like in your time administering Albert Park Basketball Stadium and just administering basketball in general, do you have any recollection or observation of Melbourne Uni involvement in the competitions that you organised or successes?
Only from those second division competitions, and the one year that they played in First Division, in which, if my memory serves me correctly, they struggled a bit. But otherwise, the connection is more with my teaching the Phys Ed course, and basically following the progress of some of the people who are involved who had different pathways, like the Speeds and Peter Byrne and John Maddock and, you know, others.
That's great.
Henry and, you know, that, and
yeah, that's fantastic.
That group. So, but it is, on reflection, unusual that the university basketball didn't have the women's program at that time, in those days, and but that shouldn't be so surprising. When we opened the Alva Park Stadium, women's basketball had only been functioning for a few years. In fact, Ken Watson got a directive from FIBA to say basketball in Australia should give more attention to women's basketball. Ken was too busy to do it himself, and that's when he recruited his wife, who became the first president of women's basketball, and she did an outstanding job. Very bright lady, just died recently, but Ken put an advertisement in the Sporting Globe. This might have been said in my books or Andrew's books or whatever, but he put an ad in the Sporting Globe for women to try out for basketball, join a team. The respondents were mostly softball players and some netball players, and so clinics were conducted for the girls, and almost like the rest is history, how in the early days they struggled to improve their standards. But when you look at the women's basketball today, they're as good as anywhere in the world.
More success than the Aussie men.
Yeah, and so they've evolved with the sport to the highest level, and with good coaching and good competition, and you know, getting major competitions at the highest level. But unlike the men, they didn't travel like we did. You know, it's pretty much all internal. But they've really, I think, progressed remarkably well when you consider the international level that they're at now. I think they might be rated third in the world now.
Very good rating.
Yeah, and considering we were late starters by comparison with the Europeans, the Americans were later starters. If you think about their progress was only made when they introduced Title IX. Women's basketball in America was almost non-existent. But when they introduced Title IX, I don't know if you know that, heard that, but Title IX in the States, there's government legislation that equal amounts of funding should be given to women's sport as men's sport in the college basketball.
Right.
Now, many of them, you know, had no women's teams at all, But when they started the women's sport effectively, they were pissed off because they couldn't spend enough money on the men anymore. Because whatever they gave the men, they had to give the women.
Do you recall when Title IX roughly came about?
Oh, I had it. I had it in that my current attempts to
Could look it up
for the rules and things like that. But
and so women's basketball in Australia was probably around prior to that. And when do you recall women's basketball getting going at Albert Park?
oh, right from the start.
From the beginning?
Oh yeah.
Yep.
I can remember trying to teach some of the girls a jump shot, and I kept being told, "Girls don't jump."
How many participants would you have had in the women's competition at the beginning with Albert Park?
How many?
How many participants and teams?
Oh, the women played mostly on Wednesday nights, on the championship division nights. We didn't have women on our night. There was no women on Tuesday.
So they would have had to have a good 50 odd players, I'd imagine.
There were 3 divisions
Oh, really?
of women, same as the men.
Yep.
On the championship division nights, and I think the business hours might have been the first to start the women's programs at the domestic level.
Yep.
And then the junior girls and junior boys were.
How many teams do you think each of these divisions would have had? The women's divisions, 3 women's divisions. How many?
There would be like a total of about 30 teams.
30 teams, and how many players per team? Like maybe 7 players?
Yeah, they'd have a full roster of about 10 players.
10
per team
players.
at that level.
300 players would have been playing women's basketball at Albert Park in the late 50s.
No, it was earlier.
Earlier than that.
Oh, no, in the late 50s, early 60s.
Yep, great.
Yeah. But they started playing before we opened Albert Park under Betty Watson's direction.
Right.
And I had no idea where they were playing, which we'd never heard about.
Church halls or something.
Playing, on netball courts or somewhere like that, just being introduced to the sport. But the thing that doesn't irk me, but I don't think there's enough knowledge of the evolution of basketball that when basketball was played back in the early 20th century, and the rules were made up as you go along, effectively, and women were playing the same as men were playing way back early then, and playing pretty much like the original game of 7-a-side, and pretty much like the original rules, not necessarily original rules, but originally how they played. They played like in 3 zones on the court.
I like netball.
And so...
Lindsay, I think this would be a good topic for the other video.
No worries.
When we get into the origins of it all, but I think we've covered off on all the Melbourne Uni stuff.
Yep.
So this has been really good. Thank you so much for sharing.
Well, whatever. No problem.
Appreciate it, Lindsay. All right, thank you.
Yep, good. So if you go